Hello everyone, I am back with an update to an old video I made about scaling damage in this game. One of my most popular videos, had some of the best viewer engagement, and I've been meaning to make an update because there's been significant changes to the game, and in response to some of the feedback you guys gave me for a while now, but things have been a bit busy. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just a quick little personal blurb. In the last year and a half, I have changed careers, got married, bought a house. A couple months ago, had a kid. So things have been a bit busy, and this content creation was one of the first things on the chopping block when time constraints kicked in. So anyway, that aside, we're going to jump into it. There will be a good amount of content that is recycled from the first time because it's simply an update, but I do think there will be some significant enough differences, both in content and also in the way I explain it, and that has to do with some of the feedback that you guys provided me. So just a quick review of sort of the target audience and what I'm hoping to cover in this. Anyone who wants to be able to make their own builds or tweak their own builds. If you pull a build guide from some website, but you want to make little tweaks to adjust it to your liking, or if there are gaps in the guide that don't make it clear how to transition from early to mid game to late game, etc., then hopefully this will give you some extra tools to do that. There are a lot of unique interactions that I won't cover. There are some that I will if I think that they will help explain something, or if they're common enough that I feel like you should know. But if I were to cover all the funky, unique interactions with various unique items and things in this game, the presentation would go on for many hours. Also, I will limit exposure to direct math. However, there are cases where I feel like it's necessary. In fact, the first couple of slides I'm going to show you after this will include some. And, there are times when I think it'll help clarify a concept, but there are a lot of cases where I will avoid it because I think it'll just bog things down a bit. And finally, just sort of the topic on the whole is, figuring out and understanding how damage is calculated and then scaling it efficiently so you can make your characters do the deeps. And so the first topic I want to touch on is that of base damage. And so base damage is the starting value, which is then modified to get your final damage output. And for attacks, this is provided by your weapon. For spells, this is provided by the skill gem itself. And I've put a couple examples here. There's a weapon on the left, a common leveling unique called the Redbeak Sword. It has a couple of modifiers on it that alter the base damage. So if you were to find a white rusted sword, which is the base type of this item, it would deal 4 to 9 damage. And these modifiers here, the adds 2 to 6 physical damage and 50% increased physical damage, get applied to that 4 to 9 and then show up at the top with those calculations already factored in. It is also worth noting that quality acts as additional increased physical damage, so you can think of this 20 and this 50 together as being combined to, say, 70% increased physical damage. On the right, we have the Fireball skill gem, and this is a picture from the wiki page. So it does show the low and high end of the damage range, but also for both the low and the high, it shows the range for both from a level 1 skill gem all the way up to level 20. Normally, you won't see that when you're looking at the skill gems in game. But anyway, you can see at level 20, at the low end of a roll, this does 1095 damage. At the high end, it's 1643, and that's how much damage this skill would deal if you had no other modifiers, no other increases or additions to your damage at all. So I know I said I'd limit exposure to direct math, but this is important to touch on because it helps you identify good weapons if you're going to be playing an attack skill. And so if you look here, I lay out how the base damage is calculated. So the innate weapon base damage. So if you were to find a white item on the ground, that's the innate weapon base damage. You add that to local additive modifiers. So this is a local modifier. It's on the weapon itself. And it says adds 2 to 6 physical damage. You multiply that by local multiplicative modifiers. Again, percentage changes on the weapon itself. So again, this increased physical damage and the quality, remember, factors in. You then, to figure your total damage output later, take the base damage, and this is actually true for, this part is true for spells as well. You take global additive modifiers. So an example would be on this ring right here, 4 to 14 physical damage if you get the best rolls on the implicit are added to your attacks. That's global because it's a mod not on your weapon. And then multiplied by global multiplicative modifiers. So again, if we look at this ring, 60 to 80% increased attack damage if your other ring is a shaper item. So if we say, you got another 60 or 80% increased, that and this mod right here would be applied on top of the base damage, right? So it's kind of, again, a two-stage calculation. First, the base damage is calculated, then additive modifiers from other gear are added, and then multiplicative modifiers are multiplied. That's the order of operations for how things work for calculating damage here. How do you know if something is a local modifier? Because weapons do have global modifiers on them. And this Doriani's Catalyst is an example. It has 2 global modifiers. Actually, it has more than 2, but specifically the increased elemental damage here and here are the global modifiers that I'm highlighting. And how do you know if something is local or global? Well, a quick cheat sheet. If it says adds damage, whether that's physical or elemental or chaos damage, it's local. Any additions to damage on the weapon themselves are local, as far as I know. Any percentage increases to physical damage on the weapon themselves and quality are also local. Any other increases are considered global as well. Sometimes weapons will have conditional modifiers, which will also be global. So on this item, for example, it says 100% increased damage when on low life. So this is conditional because it's not always active. It's only when your life is low. And so this is a global modifier. It would affect, let's say, spell damage, for example, even though it's on an attack-based weapon. So it's a little confusing, but that's a quick cheat sheet that should let you accurately identify what's local and global most of the time. As well, on the item itself, all the local modifiers should be aggregated together. So there's more than one line of text, affix, stat on the item that can say increased physical damage, and they'll all be aggregated into one big number. So if there was another 50% increased physical damage roll on this, they would just get added to say 100% increased physical damage. So you'll get used to spotting it, and it'll feel easier and more intuitive later, but it can be a little bit confusing because they don't actually explicitly say local or global generally. As mentioned, no calculations are necessary for spells because it's literally just listed on the skill gem, and technically no calculations are necessary for weapons either because they do them for you already, right? This includes those calculations. One other thing to mention is that, even though the additive damage for elemental is technically part of base damage, because there is no local multiplicative modifier, there's in a lot of ways not functionally a difference that I'm aware of right now between a local elemental additive modifier and a global one. So now the damage source. This is a property of the damage, indicates how the damage is being dealt, where it's coming from. So it can be an attack, a spell, damage over time, or secondary. Technically, reflected damage kind of fits in here, but it's not really worth going into too much because you basically can't scale that. It's very, very hard anyway. Damage can only have one source, and it typically is identified on the skill gem. So even though damage can only have one source, you can deal damage from multiple sources. For example, you could attack an enemy, you hit them, and the hit itself deals attack damage. Then the hit applies a bleed, which deals damage over time. So in one skill use, you've generated two sort of different packets of damage that are both coming from separate sources, one from the attack itself and one from the damage over time. And so I've just highlighted here at the top these keywords, these little tags, indicate various properties of the skill being used. This is the ground slam skill, and it is an attack, so it deals attack damage. It can apply other like ailment damage over time, though, but it doesn't inherently. Damage type is a property of the damage, so physical, lightning, cold, fire, and chaos are the types of damage you can deal. Again, damage can only have one type, so if you deal multiple types of damage, let's say you deal a split between physical and fire damage, then they will be modified separately and they will act as sort of distinct packets. You'll have some modifiers that apply to both. Like let's say you attack and your attack converts 50% of physical to fire damage. If you then have a modifier that says increased attack damage, your packet of fire damage and your packet of physical damage would both be affected by that modifier. But then you might have modifiers that only affect one or the other. So for example, if you had a modifier that said increased fire damage, it would only affect the chunk of damage that's fire damage. It would not affect the physical damage. And that's why I say they're sort of distinct packets or entities that are used to go through different steps of calculating the final damage output, even if there are shared steps between them. Keywords. They are properties of damage, and any damage you deal from a skill that causes it kind of inherits the keywords. This is an exception with damage over time. It doesn't exactly inherit those keywords, but the hit damage itself does inherit the keywords. And so I list just some examples here, but also show you on the next page here another attack skill, and I've highlighted all the various keywords associated with it. So it's an attack, its area of effect is what the AoE stands for, and melee. So for example, any damage you dealt with this skill, if you had a modifier that said percent increased damage or percent increased area damage or percent increased melee damage, either of those, both of those, would affect your damage output. Whether it's physical, chaos, or elemental, it doesn't matter in that case. Damage modifiers are things that modify your damage. Either positively or negatively, most of the time, you're going to be looking for things that improve your damage, that increase it. I referenced conditional modifiers earlier. Just again, those are modifiers which are not always used as part of the calculations. Some other condition must be true before they are incorporated into the calculation. So I provide some examples here. Damage modifiers sometimes are very clear in terms of how much they affect your damage. So for example, if you have a modifier that says 50% increased damage, and it's the first bit of increased damage that you have, your damage goes up by 50%. It's very clearly stated. If, however, you have 30% critical strike chance and 400% critical strike multiplier and 95% accuracy, how much does that modify your damage? We'll go into that in more detail later, but I'm just pointing out that there are modifiers that are a bit more complicated, that require multiple steps of calculations to figure out how much is this actually improving my damage. Also worth noting that many skills have damage effectiveness modifiers on them. So what that means, and I've highlighted right here, the skill Blade Vortex has a 25% damage effectiveness modifier. That means any global additive modifiers only apply at 25% of the listed value. So if you had an item that, let's say, said adds 100 physical damage to spells, because this is a spell, it would actually only add 25 physical damage to this spell. And the reason for this most of the time has to do with the mechanics of the skill. Every time you cast a blade with Blade Vortex, it spins around you and it can hit the same enemy a bunch of times. And so therefore, they've added this damage effectiveness multiplier to make it so that you don't get extra value out of it that you would not be getting with other skills, right? If this hits an enemy 4 or 5 times, it would be insane for that additive damage modifier to affect this skill in the same way that other skills are affected. My cat is saying hi. I also point out some conditional modifiers on this item, Razor of the Seventh Sun, if you've ignited an enemy recently and against ignited enemies. So this mod only kicks in if you've ignited an enemy in the last 4 seconds, which is what recently means. And this modifier only kicks in if the enemy is currently ignited. You will see in this game the modifiers more or less. And what that means is that they are always separate multiplicative modifiers. So if you see something that says 50% more damage, it's always 50% more damage. Now, there are some sort of exceptions where there are more modifiers that are based on a certain number of stacks. So an example would be frenzy charges. Frenzy charges add 4% more damage per charge, but that all gets aggregated into one big more multiplier. As well, they add attack and cast speed, but not relevant to what I'm pointing out here. So I say here, in bold and underlined, separate multiplicative modifiers are always equal to or better than an aggregated equivalent. So for other damage modifiers that exist, like increased damage, which you'll see a lot on your passive skill tree, all your damage increases that are global get aggregated into one big number. So if you have 50% increased damage over here, 100% over here, another 50% over here, that all gets lumped together to be 200% increased damage. So the math is a little different, right? If you're going to have 200% increased damage, you take your current damage and you multiply it by 3 to get 200% increased damage. If they were all separate more modifiers, instead, you would take your current damage, multiply it by 2, then multiply it by 1.5, then multiply it by 1.5. And so the more modifiers are better if the values are equivalent. And so the reason I say that they're always equal to or better than an aggregated equivalent is because you hit diminishing returns. And I'll come back to this concept repeatedly with any kind of aggregated multiplier. And most of the multipliers in this game are aggregated into one big number. People tend to describe damage increases in a slightly misleading way, where they say that it's not a more modifier. It is a more modifier. It's just one very large aggregated more modifier. But again, that's true of all the others that we're going to talk about as well. Things like penetration, or things like physical damage added as additional fire damage, etc. Stuff like that. They're actually all aggregated multipliers. The increased damage aggregated multiplier is just the most common by far, and so tends to experience the highest amount of diminishing returns. One thing to note is that damage increases are really efficient early on, and that's because the amount you can get per, resource invested is very high. So yes, they hit diminishing returns quickly, but early on, again, they are by far the most impactful on your damage for the amount you invest. I provide some other examples of aggregated multipliers, but we will touch on them in more detail later. And so this is what I'm saying about diminishing returns. They become less efficient as the sum total of the aggregate increases. And just a quick little mathematical example to point that out. if you have no increases to damage currently and you get 100% increased damage, it doubles your damage. If you then go from 100 to 200% increased damage, your damage now only goes up by 50%. If you then go from 2 to 300% increased damage, your damage now only goes up by a third, etc., etc. And that continues to get less and less as as a relative proportion of your current damage as you invest more in that particular multiplier. I'm just showing you a quick example of another aggregated multiplier here, which is enemies take increased physical damage. This is not to be confused with increased damage. It is separate when it says enemies take increased damage. So the War Banner at level 20 gives 11% increased physical damage taken by enemies. And then this helmet, if you were also wearing it, would provide another 9%. They'd be lumped together so that enemies would take 20% increased physical damage. So you'd basically be dealing 20% more physical damage with these two items equipped, assuming that you deal all physical damage. Next, we'll touch on conversion. Conversion is very common in this game. It's inherent on some skill gems. There's item modifiers, both unique and rare item modifiers that can provide damage conversion. And there's also stuff on the passive tree that can provide damage conversion. So it always happens in a particular order, as shown here: physical to lightning, to cold, to fire, to chaos. It doesn't have to go through each step, but for each step that does happen, it will happen in this order. So if you convert from physical to lightning and then lightning to chaos, it will happen in that order. You won't go from physical to chaos and then convert back to lightning. It cannot happen in that way, at least not currently in the game. It can be full or partial. So if you only partially convert your damage, then you will be dealing a chunk of two different kinds of damage. For example, you could be dealing 50% physical, as I mentioned earlier, and 50% fire. Again, those packets will be modified separately only by those modifiers that happen to apply to them. It's also worth noting that any damage that is converted kind of remembers what damage it was previously. So if you convert 50% of your physical damage to fire damage, if you then have a modifier that says increased physical damage, it will actually affect both the physical part and the fire part, because the fire part used to be physical. Kind of confusing. However, it does make it a bit easier to scale your damage if you have converted it. The conversion that comes from skill gems is inherent and cannot be changed. And so I have an image on this next slide here of the skill Static Strike, where it says 60% of physical damage converted to lightning. Because it's on the skill gem, always at least 60% of the physical damage will be converted. Now, if you get some additional damage conversion, let's say you get 50% from a unique pair of gloves of physical to cold, and then you get another 50% physical to lightning from the support gem that converts 50% of this skill to lightning damage. What happens is it gets scaled, because now you have 50 plus 50 plus 60. You have 160% total conversion. That gets scaled to fit within 100%, except inherent to the skill gem, this does not get scaled. It's actually the other two conversion modifiers that get scaled. So again, 60% lightning from this, locked in. The remaining 40% damage is now split evenly between the 50% lightning conversion from the support gem and the 50% from the unique item. So in that situation, you deal 80% lightning damage and 20% cold damage. So again, it's scaled so that, because you can't convert more than 100% of the damage. So everything is scaled except the modifier on the skill gem, if there is one. There is not always. There is a mod that says X% of Y damage added to Z. So 20% of physical damage added as fire would be an example of that. It's not conversion. It doesn't actually change the 20%. However, it just sort of snapshots the 20% physical base that you have and then adds it on top as additional fire damage. So now it's kind of like you're dealing 100% physical plus 20% more fire damage. So it's essentially another aggregated multiplier, assuming that your base is entirely physical or whatever it is that's being added from. So there's another kind of, it's almost like an edge case, except that there is an ascendancy that does this, and then there's this extremely common unique item that does it, where if there are multiple stages of conversion that occur, so you convert physical to lightning, then lightning to cold, then cold to fire, and then fire to chaos, and you have this mod that says non-chaos damage added as extra chaos damage, or elemental damage added as extra chaos damage, all of the applicable steps in the conversion process, it kind of snapshots a chunk of damage from that part of the conversion process. So if we just assume that you were able to convert 100% of your physical to lightning, 100% of that lightning to cold, 100% of that cold to fire, and then you got this item right here, the 15% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage would take 15% of the lightning damage, 15% of the cold, and 15% of the fire, and add it all on top. So effectively, it would be giving you 45% more damage in that case. Usually there's partial conversion. It's hard to actually convert 100% at all steps, but the bottom line is that it can be an incredibly powerful modifier because of the fact that it pulls base damage sort of from each step in the conversion process. So I talked about increased and reduced damage. Again, as I said earlier, there's nothing magical about it per se. It is just a multiplicative modifier, just like all the others that you have available. But again, it's worth noting that it is by far the most common one. It is extremely efficient. The initial few 100% or so that you invest into it, and then it starts hitting very substantial diminishing returns the more you have invested, and you will probably want to branch out into investments in other multipliers later on. Sorry, my cat is making this more complicated. As well, it is worth noting that all of it gets aggregated together, even if the sort of like keywords and tags that are pointed to by increased damage are different. So let's say you were using a skill that dealt entirely lightning damage. I, on this page here, have highlighted modifiers that would all apply in an aggregated fashion to that damage you're dealing. So if you dealt 60% increased spell damage, 100% increased elemental damage, 20% increased lightning, and 32% increased elemental from this implicit, all that would get added together to be 212% increased damage, and it would get, so therefore you would multiply your current damage by 3.12, and that is how much you would be dealing after the fact. So they all get aggregated together, even if the associated tags and keywords are different on them. Next is attack and cast speed. So similar to attacks and spells, the base attack speed is provided by your weapon. The base cast speed is found on the skill gem specifically. And I've provided some examples here. So this item right here, it's Ziri's Disfavor. This is the base attack speed listed. It's showing a range again because this is from the wiki page, and this is the range at which the item can drop, because there's a roll that isn't the same number every time down here. And the cast time is listed on the spell gem, which is actually just the inverse of the cast speed. So you just take 1 and divide it by this. So 1 divided by 0.7 equals 1.43 casts per second. That is the base cast speed for the arc spell. So similar to how base damage worked, as I described earlier, base attack speed works in the same way, where the increased attack speed listed on the weapon does modify the actual base from like the white version of the weapon, the unmodified version of the weapon, and then they do the math for you. Again, there are conditional modifiers and things that will apply globally instead, and then be multiplied at a later stage in the calculations, just like I described earlier. The order of operations for attack speed and cast speed is the same. So again, the local modifiers are applied first the additive, which don't exist currently, then the local multiplicative modifiers, and then, again, global additive and global multiplicative. Right now, I'm not aware of any global additive modifiers that exist. Another important thing worth mentioning, as highlighted on this Earthquake skill gem, is there is a attack speed multiplier. This is kind of like the added damage effectiveness that I referenced earlier, where in this case, whatever your attack speed is actually gets reduced by 25% when you use Earthquake. Again, that's typically to help balance around a really large base damage, which Earthquake does have. It's got a huge base damage between its initial hit and aftershock. Going into the detailed mechanics of this skill is outside the scope of this, but suffice to say that this is important to pay attention to, because if you're looking at the base damage of a skill and you see that it looks like a good base damage, this skill deals 200% of your attack damage or 400% of your attack damage, look and see if the attack speed multiplier balances that out and makes it weaker than you think upon first glance. Accuracy. Only affects attacks. Spells do not care about accuracy. It is compared against the evasion stat of your enemy to determine your chance to hit, which is in percentage form. And monster evasion does increase with levels, and there are certain modifiers. There are evasive monsters that are harder to hit than normal. And in fact, your character sheet kind of distinguishes between hitting normal enemies and more evasive enemies. You cannot have more than 100% chance to hit, and it is used a second time, as it says here, to determine if a critical strike succeeds. So first, when you hit an enemy, the chance is rolled. So if you have a 95% chance to hit, let's say you hit them, it's determined that you've succeeded, as you will 95% of the time. And then now you have some critical strike chance. You actually have to roll against accuracy a second time. So accuracy is much more important for critical strike based characters. So it's shown right here on this character. I think this is without certain auras and stuff on. I don't remember what the status was with this character. The stats look terrible. But that aside, it says main hand chance to hit is 89%. Base critical strike chance, again, similar to base attack damage and base attack speed, is determined by weapons for attacks and skill gems for spells. And so, just as a quick example here, again, the crit chance is shown at the top of the weapon with the math already done for you. Right? And right here, I'm showing you the local modifier of critical strike chance. Again, this value is really important because it boosts your base crit chance, which then makes all other modifiers to it more effective. And then this spell right here shows the base crit chance of the Ice Spear spell. Again, you may see increased critical strike chance on weapons that is not local. If it either says global or it's conditional in some way, then it's going to be global and not local. And we'll follow that sort of same set order of operations that we've discussed already with attack damage and attack and cast speed. I've kind of already gone through this, just again pointing out how important chance to hit is for attack-based crit builds. There is a modifier you will find sometimes called lucky critical strikes. All lucky means is that you roll the chance to crit twice and the better outcome is taken. So if one of them is a successful roll and one of them is a failure, then you'll get the successful roll. And so lucky crit chance is completely useless at 0 or 100%. Obviously, if you already have 100% crit chance, why do you need to roll twice? If you have 0% crit chance, no need to roll twice. You know that you miss every time. And so at 50% crit chance, lucky is the most effective, and then as you approach 0 or 100, it becomes less effective. So just sort of as a general rule of thumb, you probably want something like 20 to 80% crit chance for you really are too worried about having lucky critical strikes, though it is pretty easy to get because of the diamond flask, which provides that stat for you temporarily while the flask is active. Crit chance is shown on your character sheet. However, it does not factor in lucky crit strikes, and it does not factor in accuracy. So with those two things factored in, it's often called your effective crit chance, because your true crit chance is influenced by you having less than 100% accuracy or having lucky critical strikes active, right? So if you, let's say, have a 50% accuracy, then whatever your crit chance is, if it says 100% crit chance, you actually only have 50% crit chance because, again, as I stated earlier, accuracy, that chance to hit, is rolled a second time if you've rolled a successful crit to determine if you do actually crit or not. And it'll cancel it out if you fail. Generally speaking, if you can find additive modifiers to crit chance, they're typically more powerful than global multiplicative modifiers. So as an example here, the increased critical strike support gem has both on it, right? It has both % increased critical strike chance and plus to critical strike chance. So as an example, if you, let's say, had a, let's pretend this was 2%, just for easy math's sake, and this is 90%. If you have a weapon with a 6% base critical strike, and you add 2% on top of it, then it makes it so that all these other increases are 33% more effective, because they're multiplying by 8 now instead of 6. And these are just way less common. Technically speaking, you could have a situation where an increased crit chance modifier does give you more crit early on, but as with sort of standard damage increases, there are diminishing returns the more that you have. And so this addition to your base critical strike chance tends to always be effective just because of how sort of rare it is. There's only a handful of places you can find it. Your default critical strike multiplier is 150%. That means by default, if you have no additional stats that change crit multiplier, when you crit, you deal 50% more damage. You deal 150% of your normal damage. The more crit chance you have, the more effective crit multiplier is, and vice versa. As you might imagine, if you have 0% crit chance, you can have a million crit multiplier and it does nothing because you never crit. And if you have really low crit multiplier, let's say for some reason it was reduced to just 100%, you could have 100% crit chance and it wouldn't really matter because every time you crit, you deal no extra damage. So the more crit chance you have, the more crit multiplier is effective, and vice versa. And so you want a nice balance of the two of them. There's also just sort of the argument for consistency. It feels really bad if, especially if you have a slow hitting build, if 1 out of every 5 hits is a crit. So the way you calculate, and this is actually true for anything that has a chance and sort of a multiplier, the actual damage modifier is your effective crit chance by the extra crit damage. So let's pretend you have a 50% effective crit chance, like a true crit chance, and your crit multiplier is 300%. What that means, if you have a 300% crit multiplier, you're doing 200% extra damage, right? The 100% is just the the base you're already dealing. That 200% is multiplied by 50%, which gives you 100%. So 50% effective crit chance with a 300% critical strike multiplier doubles your damage. Just as a quick example. And so I show, again, the same character, right? 239% crit multi, so there's 9% bonus damage when I crit, times the crit chance. Don't worry about, effective crit chance. You can multiply these together in a calculator, 139 times 0.223, to show that this is giving my character about 31% more damage, which is terrible. Again, this character looks like garbage. I wonder if there's missing items on them or something. Okay, so this is one of the additions to the damage scaling guide from before. Impale didn't exist in the game. I think it was introduced immediately after in the next patch, after the video that I created previously. Currently, it only works with physical damage attacks. I think there's some really edge case exception, but for the most part, you can consider Impale to be an attack-only modifier right now. I do reference it, though. It's on the passive tree, and there's a support gem for it, and so there's item modifiers. It's pretty common. When an Impale stack is applied, it snapshots 10% of the damage of the hit that applied it, and then lasts for 5 hits. So if my guy hits an enemy for 100 damage, and I impale them, the Impale stack sits on them. It remembers that 10% of that damage I dealt, so 10% of 100 is 10, will then be applied for the next 5 hits against them. No matter how big or small those hits are, those subsequent hits, it doesn't matter. It's only about the hit I dealt that applied the Impale stack. So what this means is that a 20% Impale chance is 10% more damage on average. That's because, again, they last for 5 hits. A 20% chance is a 1 in 5, so that means on average you're keeping 1 Impale stack on them at all times, and thus you're dealing 10% more damage. So 100% Impale chance gives a character 50% more damage. And then there is also an Impale effect, which is kind of like a crit multiplier. So whatever amount additional damage you're getting from Impale chance, you just multiply Impale effect by that. So if you have, 100% Impale chance, which, as indicated by this right here, is giving you 50% more damage, and you have 100% increased Impale effect, then now you're going to be dealing about 100% more damage instead of 50% more damage. Impale deals reflected physical damage. Not super important to be concerned about, except just worth mentioning. They do this to make it really hard to scale, so you don't get stats that double dip and basically take effect twice and cause these crazy exponential increases in damage. It's also worth noting that reflected damage does not apply on hit effects. So things like leech, for example, your leech calculations will not factor in the Impale damage. Reflected damage can't then be reflected back to you, etc. Things like that. It also doesn't affect stun, on and on. And so, as I mentioned before, Impale chance and Impale effect really in a lot of ways are kind of like crit chance and crit multiplier. There's an interplay between them where you need a healthy balance of both of them to get the best effect from the Impale stat. Resistance reduction and penetration. Another important one if you're going to be dealing elemental damage. Technically it exists for physical damage, but it's a little different for physical damage in that with physical damage, there's a stat called Overwhelm. You cannot exceed the amount of physical resistance they have. So if an enemy has little to no physical resistance, which is true for most enemies in the game, then it doesn't do very much for you, but it's still helpful to overcome certain map mods, and some bosses have high enough armor values that it can be meaningful a little bit. But we're going to basically ignore that for this discussion. So, enemy resistances are aggregated with resistance reduction and penetration. So what that means is this is kind of a funky stat because you can't really know how much it's affecting your damage unless you also know how much resistance the enemy has. It can be assumed that endgame bosses have 50% elemental resistance, and then there's awakener levels and things like that. But then there are map modifiers. So in maps, enemies may have different amounts than that, and then there's also rare enemies that have, additional resistances beyond whatever the map modifiers indicate. And so it is a very dynamic calculation that has to be done. Suffice to say that both resistance, reduction, and penetration are almost always good stats to have. It's really hard to have so much that diminishing returns dramatically reduce their effectiveness. And another nice thing is that resistance, reduction, and penetration are more effective against high resistance enemies. So the reason for this is because normally, as I've said before, when you invest more and more in a given multiplier, you experience diminishing returns and the effectiveness goes down the more of it you have. Well, normally you're starting from 0, right? So you're going from 0 to 50% increased damage for that first 50% increased damage you get. Well, with resistance, reduction, and penetration, you actually might be starting from a negative number, right? Because if an enemy has 50% resistance against the type of damage you're dealing half damage to start with. So you're starting in the negative, so it takes longer before you hit those diminishing returns. And it also means that the initial bits that you invest are even more efficient. They're incredibly efficient. So if an enemy has 50% resistance to the damage type you're dealing, let's pretend you're using arc. You're dealing lightning damage, and an enemy has 50% lightning resistance. If you get 50% penetration, it doubles your damage, right? You're going from dealing half damage to full damage. So you've doubled it. The next 50% you get, it does actually give you 50% more damage because you can penetrate into negative numbers. But suffice to say that those initial bits of penetration you get are going to make a huge difference against bosses and such in particular. Resistance reduction can also bring enemies into the negative. However, the difference between penetration and reduction is that penetration applies from sort of their effective value. So in this game, resistances are capped, elemental resistances and chaos resistance are capped at 75%. And so if an enemy, let's say for some reason had 100% resistance to elemental damage, it would actually just get scaled down to 75. And so penetration penetrates based on that effective resistance they have. Reduction actually cares about that overcapped value and will reduce from that overcapped value. And so it won't really, if for some reason they have more than 75% resistance, it won't really do anything unless the amount you're reducing them is greater than the amount they've exceeded that 75 cap. Another important distinction is that penetration works with hits. It does not work with damage over time. However, resistance reduction actually debuffs the enemy, and so damage over time is affected by resistance reduction. Penetration, as I say here, kind of ignores their resistances. Resistance reduction actually changes their resistances, just to help create that distinction. Damage over time is one of the things I didn't talk about in the previous version of this guide, so we're going to go into it here. It's a little more complicated and unintuitive. This is in part because there used to be a system in place where double dipping was possible. Again, the same modifier applied more than one time, and so you get these crazy exponential increases to damage. Basically, the ailments were affected by the hits that applied them, the size, but no longer is that true. Not exactly. Anyway, for damage over time, there's both ailment and non-ailment forms. So in this game currently, Ignite, Bleed, and Poison are the ailments. Non-ailment damage over time comes from specific skills. I list a few here. So they're not ailments, but they'll usually make some kind of like ground effect, let's say, or something like that, that when the enemy stands on it deals damage over time. Again, worth reiterating, damage over time is unaffected by penetration, and if I didn't say this earlier, it cannot be converted. So even if you have a case where, let's say you have an item that says normally ignite can only be caused by fire damage. But let's say you get an item, and there is one in the game, that makes it so ignites can now be caused by lightning damage. Even though lightning damage will now contribute to the size of the ignite itself is still fire damage. It just uses the lightning damage in combination with fire damage to determine how much fire damage the ignite is going to deal. So damage over time is always its inherent type, and we'll go through that on the next slide here. Damage ailments have differing numbers of stacks that they can apply and damage types they deal, etc. And I'm going to go to this page real quick, and then we'll backtrack. But I show you here the maximum number of instances for each ailment that they can have. And so at any given time, technically all instances that exist on them will be running at the same time, but only the largest instance will actually be dealing damage at any given time. So if you hit an enemy, if you see here ignites, you can only have one instance at a time, and they last for 4 seconds. If you hit an enemy, let's say, just for ease of thinking about this, let's say you hit an enemy 4 times simultaneously, and there's a base damage roll between 50 and 100, and one of them deals 50, one of them deals 60, one of them deals 70, and one of them deals 80. The fire damage dealt by the ignite for the 80 damage roll will be the highest, and all of them will be happening at the same time, but only the one from the 80 damage roll will actually be applied to them. If then halfway through that, 2 seconds into that, you did another ignite that dealt 60 damage as a base, then that would be ticking away at the same time, and when that first 4-second chunk of 80 damage ran out, the remaining 2 seconds you have left over from that 60 damage ignite you applied halfway through would start ticking. Right? So again, they technically all are running at the same time, but all of them except the highest one are ignored. Be careful of applicable keywords for damage modifiers with damage over time. It is confusing, and generally it needs to specifically specify either the damage type or that it's damage over time for it to have an effect. So increased attack damage does not affect the bleed damage applied by that attack, right? Remember that there's different sources: attack, spell, damage over time. So technically it's a different source of damage, and that's why. Ailment damage is not directly related to the damage of the hit by which it was applied, in the sense that, again, all those modifiers, those increases, don't apply. However, the same base damage is used typically. There might be some weird instances in the game where you can separately modify the base of the damage over time, but so let's go back a little and find this image here. So this weapon does about 300 to 400 damage per hit. So this base right here would be used to figure out how big of a bleed you deal. But then after that base is used, then calculations would be done separately for the packet of damage that's dealing the bleed damage and the packet that's dealing the hit damage. Critical strikes by default do affect damage over time because there is a damage over time crit multiplier of 150%. But generally when you find critical strike multiplier on stuff, it does not affect damage over time. It doesn't add on top of that 150%. Unless you take the keystone, Perfect Agony, it's a keystone on the passive tree, which makes critical strike multiplier apply to your ailments at some effectiveness, reduced effectiveness, I believe. So these are kind of the general characteristics of the different ailments. So Ignite is always fire damage, Bleed is always physical, and as of right now can only be applied by attacks. And Poison is chaos damage. And although it itself is chaos damage, it's scaled by both physical and chaos. So but the base physical and base chaos will be used to determine how big the poison is, but the poison itself will always be chaos. You can see they have differing number of stacks. Bleed is 1, Ignite is 1. Bleed can go up to 8 with the Crimson Dance keystone. Again, it's another keystone on the tree. And Poison is infinite. The durations, the base damages, etc. Now, here are the concepts that are important to understand. So a lot of times people say that attack and cast speed don't scale ailment damage. And it's only partially true. Some concepts to remember: as the maximum number of ailment stacks approaches infinity, like what you have with Poison, there is no maximum. Attack and cast speed and duration are true multipliers, right? So every additional stack of Poison, because it gets to actually run and deal its damage, is just more damage. And same with duration. If you double the duration of the Poison, each Poison stack deals twice as much damage. When they have lower maximum stacks, there are diminished returns with having attack and cast speed or duration. But the reason that they do affect your damage is because there's a damage range that can be rolled. So let's say the base damage that you deal is 100 to 200. If you hit them and get the lowest roll, you only deal 100 damage, and then you don't hit them again for 4 seconds in the case of Ignite to apply another one. Well, if you just would have hit them again sooner, then you could have potentially applied a higher number within that 1 to 200 range. You could potentially be dealing double damage. So reapplying the ailments is still a good idea because it will help make sure that the ailment you're applying is keeping to the higher end of that range available on average. So similarly, as the relative difference between the low and high end of the damage range approaches infinity, attack and cast speed and duration approach true multipliers, but never quite actually reach them. It's kind of an asymptotic relationship. So because infinite damage range doesn't exist. So essentially, it becomes more important if you have spikier damage, if you have really wide damage ranges. So dealing, let's say if you dealt 100 to 150 as a base versus 1 to 300 damage. If your base is 1 to 300 damage, because of how big that spread is, it's more important to have some attack and cast speed or duration to help make sure you're keeping at the higher end of that range. As damage uptime approaches 0, duration approaches a true multiplier. So damage uptime is a concept that I'll touch on again later, but this sort of is like a real-world combat type stat where, if you're fighting a boss and they have mechanics that you have to dodge, while you're dodging them, you're not dealing damage. Except with damage over time, you actually are. But if, it reduces the number of times that you can reapply your ailments, then duration will be helpful again in making sure that you're keeping at the higher end of the damage range at all times. And so if in really tough fights, duration actually is quite helpful, is essentially the kind of TLDR of these last two lines. Against trash mobs and everything, duration does basically nothing. Another bit I added into this is choosing your weapon setup. So what are the considerations for choosing a weapon? There's the implicit role. So some weapons have defensive ones, like staffs have block chance. Some of them have crit-based ones or accuracy-based ones. There's some that just don't have implicits, but just deal more base damage. There's some that give chance to bleed, etc., etc. What's the passive support like on the tree? So on the passive skill tree, certain weapon types have better support for, let's say, critical strikes or for bleeds, or for casters, or things like that. So you might want to take a look at what's available on the tree. Is there a movement skill that you really like to use that requires a specific weapon? For example, if you like whirling blades, it requires, I believe, like a dagger, a claw, or a sword, something like that. So anyway, if there is a movement skill that cares about your weapon type. Base attack speed, base crit chance, and base damage all matter, obviously, at least for attack-based characters. And then also there's weapon types that specifically are better at rolling caster or attack mods. For example, there's daggers, and then there's rune daggers being the ones that roll caster mods more easily. There's staves, and there's war staves being the ones that roll attack mods more easily, etc. And then there's the debate of two-handed versus dual wield versus shield. And so you're just trying to figure out a balance of these different things. You know, defensive needs, do you want some block chance? Or is there some other defensive boost you can get from them? Obviously with a shield you can get like health and armor and stuff like that as well, or energy shield. Mobility, so again, you know, let's say you want to use the movement skill, shield charge, or whatever. You know, also worth considering between these things, how it impacts your movement skill or mobility options. Link constraints, if you're using a build that's really socket starved, then a two-handed weapon has the advantage of having, you know, additional sockets. Technically speaking, you don't get any extra sockets, but if you really want extra links on something, so like you want you know, a 6-link, 2 6-links, or a 6-link and a 5-link, then it does start to matter. Or if you have a situation where for some reason you can't use as many sockets on your chest, like you're using a Kaum's Heart, then it might be more important to have a two-handed weapon. A Kaum's Heart is a unique chest, by the way, that has no sockets on it. I say 7 links. Sometimes two-handed weapons have additional links built in, and they'll say something like, you know, socketed skills are supported by whatever support gem, the Fortify support gem or the Power Charge on Critical Strike support gem. So if there's some mod like that exists that's really effective for the skill you want to use, then you might consider using a two-handed weapon. And then again, the importance of attack speed. You know, are you applying one big giant bleed? Does your mobility depend heavily on your movement skill, etc., etc.? What does attack speed matter for you? Because typically one-handed weapons attack faster than two-handed weapons, and then when you dual wield, you get an additional bonus. You attack 10% faster. It's a 10% more attack speed modifier. So essentially, shields are the most defensive option. Dual wield tends to be somewhere in between, and two-handed tends to be the most damage. But this is not 100% consistent, and sometimes dual wield will result in the most damage for certain setups. Another bit that I added for this particular guide is just a quick little mention on traps, mines, and totems. I don't want to go into a ton of detail on this, but I feel it's worth mentioning because, I mean, these are builds that people use a lot. And so just keep in mind that there are some damage modifiers that may be useless for these types of skills. In general, all these things kind of inherit your damage modifiers. So if your totem is casting, you know, a fire spell, or your trap is dealing fire damage, and you have an increased fire damage modifier, it will affect the trap or totem skill. But there are certain stats that don't apply, like attack and cast speed don't really have any effect on traps or mines. Additionally, there are sort of their own unique stats that matter, like trap or mine throwing speed, or increasing the maximum number of totems, increasing the maximum number of mines, or something like that could also matter. It's also worth noting that the trap totem or mine is considered to be the one doing the casting and doing the killing. So for things like on-hit effects and on-kill effects, you actually don't receive the benefit the totem does or the trap or mine does. Sometimes functionally that does nothing. Like, for example, if a trap leeches, it doesn't do anything because the trap is destroyed. But a totem leeching actually does have an effect. And also just a quick blurb on minions. Again, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but suffice to say that if it doesn't say minion, then it probably doesn't apply to your minions, unless we're talking about debuffing an enemy. So like reducing enemy resistances, for example, obviously affects your minions because you have changed the enemy's stats. Also worth noting that making your minions tanky enough that they don't die can be a way of increasing real-world damage output. If you have to stop and recast your minions and they keep dying, then it's probably going to negatively affect your actual damage output against really tough fights. So what are the major concepts here? Aggregated damage multipliers have diminishing returns. So the more you invest into a particular stat, whether that be increased damage taken by enemies, whatever, there are diminishing returns the more you invest. Kind of a different way of rephrasing that, and I'm kind of rephrasing this in a few ways just because this is one of the most important concepts to hammer home. The less you have invested into a particular multiplier, the better your returns on that investment. And finally, the more you invest into one multiplier, the more effective other multipliers become. So the sort of idea being that you want to extend your damage through lots of different multipliers. Don't just do all damage increases. Don't do all crit chance and crit multiplier. Don't just do all penetration. You want a bit of each in most cases. Also worth mentioning, Path of Building is an incredible tool. If you've never used it, just Google search it. I believe currently you want to look for the local identity fork, which is essentially somebody carrying the torch after the original developer kind of stopped supporting it. But it's still important to think about real world scenarios. And although the numbers from Path of Building are incredibly useful for making comparisons and seeing how different changes to your gear and such will affect your damage, keep in mind again that damage uptime is very important. So in your toughest fights, things that will help make sure that you don't have to stop dealing damage will boost your actual damage output in real combat scenarios. Don't get carried away with ticking all the possible boxes. Make sure you're realistic about what buffs and things you have active when you're fighting a boss. A lot of times people really like to pad their numbers and just get the biggest number possible so that they can advertise a better guide or whatever. But then, you get in a real combat scenario and you don't have half their buffs and 50% of your damage is gone. And another thing to consider is, it's not all about damage numbers. At a certain point, things are going to feel pretty comfy with a certain amount of damage that you're dealing. And so you might want things like movement speed, which will, increase your efficiency because you spend a lot of time moving, or things like area of effect, or whatever it might be. So, a couple of case studies to apply some of these concepts a bit more. Lacerate Bleed Gladiator is like a very common League starter build you can find lots of guides for. So, what is the damage type being dealt when you're a Lacerate Bleed Gladiator? Remember, bleeds always deal physical damage, and it cannot be converted. What is the damage source? It's a bleed, so it is damage over time. And you will be dealing some damage with the attacks themselves that apply the bleeds. And then what weapon type do you want to use? Well, this is a more complicated question. Generally, people use axes for bleed setups if they're playing a melee skill like Lacerate, because they have the highest base damage, and axes have pretty good tree support for bleeds. And then the follow-up question, do you want a two-handed or dual wield or one-handed plus shield? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. If you look at the Lacerate skill gem, I underlined some important components about what the skill does. Reading the skill description is always helpful. It slashes twice. Enemies in the middle of slashes can be hit by both. Remember, if we go way back for a second to this table right here, physical damage by default, can only apply 1 stack. Well, the mechanic of Lacerate listed there that hits enemies twice if they get hit by both slashes is kind of wasted by that. Not entirely. Based on what I said, yes, it helps you, deal at the higher end of your damage range more consistently if you hit them more often. But basically, every time you attack, it hits them twice. And so what that means is that you probably want to go with Crimson Dance, which allows you to get 8 stacks of bleed. They deal half damage per stack, and they no longer deal additional damage if the enemy is moving, but it goes up to 8 stacks. And so that synergizes really well with a skill that hits twice for every attack you deal. And so I would then suggest that dual wield or one-handed and shield is the best way to go, because you're not getting nearly as much additional damage from a two-hander if if you can't attack as quickly and therefore keep at the higher end of your damage ranges. And then there's also some other modifiers I'm going to touch on here on the next slide that will make it so that you can get even more value out of attack speed and duration. So we're going to go to a website here. I'm going to pull it up on the screen, pewdb.tw/us. So what types of damage modifiers are available for this setup? I list a bunch of them here, but I want to show you this web page really quickly, because on this web page you can go through and find all potential modifiers for gear that you might want to put on your character. If you go to the mod tab, and then you sort of cycle through all the different gear slots. So let's say you go one-handed axes. You can look and see all the different prefixes and suffixes. I mean, this might look overwhelming at a quick glance here. All the different prefixes and suffixes you can get on one-handed axes. There's no quick and easy way to do this. This game just has a lot of mods in it. And so, looking through this, though, will let you identify mods that might be really powerful for your character. And so this is the one I wanted to point to in particular. 60% chance for bleeding inflicted with this weapon to deal 100% more damage. So basically this is 60% more damage for bleed builds on average. It's absolutely massive. And because it's a chance-based thing, this is just another way that now attack speed scales better, because if you can put 8 stacks on an enemy and you want to make sure all 8 of those stacks happen within this, as a result of this 60% chance, and there's a damage range, now all of a sudden attack speed becomes a much more efficient stat to scale. It's not a true multiplier, but it's a lot better than it would be otherwise. Oops. So, identify any special gear-specific modifiers you can find that are really powerful for your build. And then here's just some general ones that would apply. Increased damage, again, be careful of keywords when it comes to damage over time. Attack speed, and I had already indicated on this particular build that attack speed is pretty efficient, even though it's not a true multiplier. Crimson Dance, as I referenced earlier. The Elder Bleed mod is what I was just talking about. Increased physical damage taken by enemies. Additive physical damage. So if you get added damage on like rings or an amulet or something like that. Damage over time multiplier. Bleed duration. Bleeding you inflict deals damage faster is another stat you find on the tree. And this is another stat that actually makes it so attack speed is more effective because your bleeds have a shorter duration. And so again, it's just harder to keep stacks of those juiciest bleeds on the enemy at any given time. And then auras and mana reservation, essentially that give you any of these stats. And I just want to touch on one more here. This is the Fire Blade Vortex Chieftain. And so there's different ways you can build this, but we're going to assume a couple of things about it to make it a little easier. So what is the damage type? Well, I say at the top, it's fire damage. Blade Vortex by default is physical damage, so it does require converting. What is the damage source? Blade Vortex is a spell. And what weapon type are you going to use? There's a lot of viable options for this. A lot of this is going to come down to personal preference. Even bows can work in a lot of cases for casters. And so bow builds for Blade Vortex Chieftains are actually quite common. So again, here are some of the modifiers. I mentioned a specific keystone here, Elemental Overload. You're always going to see increased damage. Additive physical or fire damage. Physical damage added as extra fire damage. Increased fire damage taken. Fire penetration or reducing their fire resistance. Additional levels to the skill gem. Remember that with spells, the base damage is determined by the level of the skill gem. So if you can get additional levels on that skill gem from your gear or by corrupting the gem, then it tends to be a pretty significant boost. Usually it's about 10% more damage per level, though it does depend on the skill, but just as a quick rule of thumb. And then non-chaos damage added as extra chaos, unless you use the avatar of Fire Keystone that says you cannot deal other types of damage aside from fire damage. So just also worth mentioning here, some, again, particulars of using the Blade Vortex skill. You cast a blade, it spins around you, it lasts for 5 seconds, and the more blades you have, the faster they hit enemies and the more damage they deal. So maintaining up to 10 spinning blades, maintaining the highest number possible will keep your damage output a lot higher. It starts to taper off big time as the number of blades reduces. And so I mention here cast speed, duration, or the unleash mechanic all help you to basically maintain those stacks. So technically, they don't directly help you deal any more damage, but because they help you keep your stacks up, your real-world damage output will go up. And so these are just a couple of examples. You can build them differently. You can build a Fire Blade Vortex Chieftain and not use Elemental Overload. If you're unfamiliar with this keystone, it makes it so your crits don't deal extra damage, but they start an 8-second buff, which gives you 40% more elemental damage. So this is a non-crit build, but you might want to go crit. You know, you can go with a Lacerate setup that uses a two-hander if you want. I point to some reasons why you get the less value by going two-hander, but you probably still technically deal the most damage with a two-hander. Especially if you can get, a really, really nicely crafted two-hander that still has pretty high attack speed. So you can customize from here, but hopefully these examples sort of showcase, how you identify what modifiers you're looking for, right? And these are not exhaustive lists for both of these. There, I'm sure, are other modifiers, but I just made a quick table of 10 so as not to go crazy. But these are good places to start looking for, the damage modifiers that are going to help you boost your damage the most. And so you'd want to invest in each of these a bit if you can, reasonably. So that's it for now. If you have any other additional feedback for this version, I'd love to hear it. I will try and keep this up to date. This should last a little longer than the previous one, though already in the next patch that's coming out in a week or so, there's some quirky additional damage types being introduced that aren't currently in the game. So it is hard to keep up with all the content that does get added to this game. If you have other topics sort of a similar nature that you're interested in hearing about, let me know in the comments or pop by my stream. I stream on occasion at twitch.tv/cowpimp, and you can let me know what you're interested in hearing about. I was thinking about doing maybe a defense guide at some point as well. But let me know what you think. And until next time.